Today is about experiencing the climate impacts up close and personal.
If sea level rises the way that we think that they're anticipated to rise, is there may be areas in South Florida that will be uninhabitable.
Whenever there's an event, an emergency, a disaster, a lot of times it's a wake-up call.
These extreme high tides that we're experiencing are kind of the ultimate experience of sea level rise in our residents' lives.
We're not asking enough questions. We're really not asking enough of realtors who buy and sell those properties with people. Do you know what's coming? Maybe they don't know.
If we don't take these opportunities now, then the social and economic impacts in the future are going to be significantly worse.
South Florida is one of the most vulnerable regions in the world to the impacts of rising seas. Climate change is causing the ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica to melt, and as temperatures rise, the oceans are warming and expanding. According to the 2014 National Climate Assessment, seas could rise 2 feet by 2060. In Florida, 2.4 million people live within 4 feet of the local high tide line. More than 13 million of Florida's 18 million residents live in coastal counties. Coastal developments were valued in 2010 at $2 trillion.
Maybe 100 years from now or 200 years from now, if sea level rises the way that we think that they're anticipated to rise, is there may be areas in South Florida that will be uninhabitable. We need to start looking at how do we move those people away from those areas in a logical and realistic fashion now.
As sea level rise occurs, it will affect both the coastal area and the western parts. We walk all around on what I call a big sponge, and that is the aquifer, the freshwater aquifer that we use for our drinking water.
The bedrock under Florida is not solid. It has holes in it. This is the sort of bedrock we have, which means that water travels into it easily and out of it easily. And when salt water is coming in from the ocean, it can push up and just travel upwards underground. It doesn't have to have, storm sewer or anything to be able to get upwards.
And it also means that the low-lying interior, like the Everglades and stuff, are suddenly going to have pressure coming from underneath and pushing up. And so besides the salt water coming over the edge, we're going to get this sort of pushing up of fresh water in the center, and so there's going to be flooding everywhere.
Throughout South Florida, residents, non-governmental organizations, and government officials alike are trying to understand the potential impacts of sea level rise while using the newest technology available to deal with the rising waters. In Miami Beach, an area often referred to as ground zero of climate change, constant flooding during high tides and even on sunny days became a major concern and finally a political issue during the 2013 mayoral election. The promise of its new mayor, Philip Levine, was to keep the streets dry.
The 4 lanes of Alton Road, originally scheduled to open at the end of next summer, will now open this December, 7 months ahead of schedule.
Even with Levine's accelerated schedule, the flooding and the construction made life difficult for business owners. Pippa Seacrest, co-founder of the Miami Ad School, relocated her business in 2014 to the Wynwood neighborhood. But before the move, she lived with the flooding on Alton Road.
We've been in this building for 20 years, and over time the water has gotten worse and worse and worse, to the point where it rusts the undercarriage of the cars, and it's scary to walk through it because you don't know what's in that water. It can't be good for you. The students would put garbage bags over both legs and tie them to try to get to school because the school was like an island.
Then we have the structures out on the street.
Bruce Mowry, city engineer for the Miami Beach Public Works Department, was well aware of business owners' concerns, and he was installing pumps as fast as he could.
We're anticipating in excess of 70 pump stations in order to be able to manage the stormwater in our streets and to keep flooding controlled.
This structure here.
A pump station is doing nothing but basically giving us elevation. It's lifting the water from what elevation it is now in the below ground to some point high enough that it can flow then to the bay. The danger will be in the future when the sea levels come to a certain level that the water will actually become vertically up from below and flooding us.
Besides the new pumps, Miami Beach continues to upgrade its emergency programs.
We have a comprehensive all hazards program. We have a city warning point, we have a duty officer, we have an emergency operations center, and we have a 911 communication center. All of these systems work together to handle daily emergencies, but it's also designed to expand and collapse to meet whatever the need is.
We're about a half an hour past the high tide, so the water's already starting to recede.
For Nancy Gassman, Fort Lauderdale's sustainability manager, keeping up with the new technology to prevent flooding is essential.
For a city that's 100 years old, the infrastructure that controls our stormwater management is being modernized every day. But it's a challenge because most of the way that the water flows off the land has to do with gravity. We have a couple of pump systems that help us move water out of the downtown area into the New River.
And tidal valves, which are also called backflow preventers, are helping to keep the salt water out, acting as a one-way valve.
They let the stormwater come into the stormwater system and then drain out, but they don't allow for the salt water to move up the drainage system. And so it's a little flap, and so when there's stormwater on this side of the flap, it opens. And when there's seawater coming in this side of the valve, it stays closed. And so it only allows the rainfall to leave the streets rather than having the tides push salt water up into the streets. The stormwater systems were designed for a certain time and a certain sea level, but the sea level is rising. And so what the tidal valves do is they allow that useful life of that infrastructure to be extended because they provide a tool against which to fight sea level rise for a period of time.
Besides the efforts by local governments to upgrade infrastructures, organizations like the Clio Institute are devoting their time to educating the next generation on the causes as well as the impacts of climate change.
So the Clio Institute was founded in 2010, and the idea was to bridge the divide between science and society on major environmental issues. And there's no greater environmental issue right now than climate change. So what we go after is making sure that what the scientists know and what they're figuring out is happening and how fast it's happening is translated in such a way that the general public, from the young people to our elected leaders, can understand the urgency of that science.
In October 2014, as part of the Florida International University School of Journalism and Mass Communications King Tide event, Lewis held several seminars for FIU students, high school students from MAST at FIU, and Clio volunteers to help prepare them to document one of the highest tides of the year.
The blue that we have in those areas helping doing the data collection and the storytelling.
So those trainings help prepare them to speak eloquently on this issue, so when they observe the King Tide event, they have a framework into their mind why it's happening and how fast it's happening.
The speaker will actually emit a frequency which will equate to how much salt content is in the water. It's going to be either higher if there is a high salt content, but it may also be lower if we're testing fresh water that may have a much lower salt content.
They all seem to be very, very motivated by this, and I'm sure they'll try to convey their message to everyone they can, and we'll do the same. We're with Clio, and that's our job to actually spread the word, how climate change is affecting everyone. And I hope together, us with Mass Academy, FIU, and all the centers and mayors, we can make a difference.
Because of rising sea levels and excessive flooding in Miami Beach in previous years, the October 9, 2014 King Tide Day became a media event.
My name's Ari Odzer, I'm a news reporter, and we are here to cover this event regarding the King Tide flooding. And we have two U.S. senators coming here today, Sheldon Whitehouse, Rhode Island, and our own Bill Nelson from Florida.
Sea level rise is reality, and climate change is what's causing it. In fact, the projections could be as much as 2 to 3 feet if we don't change our policies. That means that most of the population of Florida would be inundated with water. I don't think we want that, and it's time for people to wake up.
Today is about experiencing the climate impacts up close and personal, because that's what climate change is. Climate change isn't about faraway places and faraway dangers. It's about impact today to the safety of our communities, to the viability of our commercial enterprises, and most importantly, it's about the public health of the families across the United States of America.
Let me just say this. This ocean, this bay right here, it's not Republican, it's not Democrat, it's not Hispanic, it's not African American, it's not white. It's all of us.
Mayor Levine is the reason that where you're standing right now is not flooded this year. Last year, this would have been under a foot of water. There would have been bay water all over here and all over Miami Beach. And since January of last year until now, which is 10 months, they've installed pumps, temporary pumps, full-time pumps. They've done all kinds of engineering feats that are amazing, and this will go on in Miami Beach. So we'll be able to live here for the next 30 or 40 years without having to have a paddle board to stand on and paddle along like on Alton Road like we used to do. So.
FIU professor Henry Briceño has been conducting water quality analysis for over a decade. One of Briceño's concerns is the quality of water that was pumped off the streets of Miami Beach into Biscayne Bay during the October 2014 King Tide event.
I did some work before King Tides in order to have something to compare to. So we sent our boats with our people to collect samples from the bay and see what the chemistry of those were, those waters, and then measuring different parameters like temperature, pHs, acidity, turbidity, etc. And then when the tides came, I sent 3 more groups to be on the island, on those places where we usually had flooding. 2 of those places we didn't have any flooding at all because the people from the city had their pumps working. But there was only one by Indian Creek that we were able to see flooding on the city, on the streets, and also collect samples. And then we found bacteria. We found bacteria in some samples with concentrations which are well beyond what's acceptable. So I know it was an event, was only one sampling event. It's not that it's permanent, it was something that was done only once.
While Miami Beach continues to monitor water quality in the bay, a company called Alta Systems is using helium balloons supplied with high-definition cameras to get an aerial view of the situation.
Sea rise is much more impactful if you see it than if you hear about it. And seeing it means you have to get a camera to the dramatic places where it occurs. So the balloon presents a unique coin advantage, if you will, a unique opportunity to get to places where it can get pictures that other platforms can't get. So, for instance, in our recent King Tide shoot, we had balloons from the street level that drifted over flooded areas and got shots that you couldn't get because you would have got wet. And we had balloons that were from the boat that took pictures on shore at phenomena that are of crucial interest to sea rise watchers, which is the water's edge. The water's edge is where the story's told. I think it would be a mistake to focus on King Tide because King Tide is the symptom. We're interested in sea rise, which is the problem.
Well, keep in mind, flooding occurs now on sunny days. Certainly on Miami Beach, Alton Road is a famous high tide, King Tide flooding. But we're seeing flooding occur as far west as Sweetwater because this is not an issue that just affects rich coastal communities. It affects the entire county across all the way to the Everglades because we are all on a very high table of water, high meaning it's close to the surface.
These extreme high tides that we're experiencing are kind of the ultimate experience of sea level rise in our residents' lives. And when they experience it personally, when their backyard floods, when they're driving through a puddle, that's the moment that they start to connect the kinds of things that they're seeing on the news with something that's happening in their neighborhood, in their lives.
Flooding affects me immensely because, you know, I like to walk. It's one of my forms of exercise. And when the streets flood and, you know, you can't get out of your own house without being soaked to death, it's, you know, it's kind of difficult. If you walk through the park or anything like on the grass, it's like walking through a sponge soaked in water.
So I'm going to enter an address here where it says search your address.
Another technological and visual approach to communicating sea level rise is a web app developed by FIU faculty.
I worked with the GIS department here at FIU to create a visualization, a map-based visualization, where people can enter their address and see what happens to their location at different levels of sea level rise.
And as I scroll all the way over to 6 feet, pretty much all of Miami Beach is underwater according to this visualization.
Sea level rise is a gradual thing. It's something that we can plan for, it's something that we can engineer for, it's something that we can mitigate for over time. Where the real emergency comes in down here is when you have storm surges on top of sea level rise.
This is exactly what happened in 2012 when Tropical Storm Sandy passed by South Florida as it headed up to the northeast.
Well, Tropical Storm Sandy was not a direct hit to South Florida or to the city of Fort Lauderdale, but it actually hovered over the Bahamas for about a week. That coupled with some high tides that we got, we were getting just waves and wind really for about a week. It was a beating. And we had to kind of push back the sand and just to make the roads passable. A month later, we experienced another high tide. And on Thanksgiving morning, 2012, 4 blocks of A1A actually collapsed. Whenever there's an event, an emergency, a disaster, a lot of times it's a wake-up call. And so events like that really kind of trigger that kind of information and that awareness, I think.
Despite these devastating events, people are still drawn to live on the water's edge.
You'll notice that here along the beach, the buildings are so close to the water. And we have this law in Florida that created what's called the Coastal Construction Control Line. And it's a line that was drawn all along Florida's sandy beaches. And basically, when you go seaward of this line, the damage from hurricanes, it increases exponentially. And do you know where that line is? It's west of A1A. So everybody's ignoring the line. Some of these buildings were here before the line was drawn, which was in the 70s. But a lot of them, they just get permits and they justify it by, oh, it's the line of construction. Everybody else is building. So we have all of these areas that are this construction that's happening so close to the shore, and it's a problem because this sand, we keep renourishing it. You shouldn't be building this close to the coastline.
We're not asking enough questions. We're really not asking enough of realtors who buy and sell those properties with people. Do you know what's coming? Maybe they don't know, but I think maybe they should be better informed. As a professional, I draw a hard line in the sand. When people asked me to buy property, and I had one who wanted to be next to the river, I told her no. I said, if you want that property, you're not buying it with me because it's a bad investment. And it's going to flood, your insurance rates are going to go up or not exist, you're going to have your house flood. What's the point of that?
Much of the Florida Keys rests about 4 feet above sea level. Realtors are already taking steps to protect their business.
There has been talk in the real estate world that we will start doing a disclosure. A disclosure the same way how you have a lead-based paint disclosure, there will be one for sea level rising in particular areas that will be a concern.
The Florida Keys are really the canary in the coal mine when it comes to climate change and sea level rise, considering that we're just an island chain of low-lying islands. We're likely, at least in the state of Florida, to see the effects of sea level rise more quickly than anybody else.
As county officials review the history of sea level rise over the years, they have become proactive in order to keep their citizens safe and to spend their money wisely.
But you don't just look at the cost, what it costs to implement measures to help us deal with sea level rise. You look at what it costs us not to do anything, because many times it's more expensive if you don't do anything, because then you're just letting the sea level rise and you're not taking any proactive measures against it.
While the seas rise, one of South Florida's major concerns is the source of its drinking water, the Everglades. Scientists have an urgent message.
Sea level rise is not just a threat to the developed part of South Florida, but it's a serious threat to the Everglades, which is a unique world-class ecosystem. And it's up to us to save the Everglades. The Everglades cannot save itself.
There will be fairly major effects and probably visible within a fairly short period of time. Vegetation's going to change, the animal populations, plant communities are all going to differ too over time.
The Everglades is our best filter, our best in terms of water quality. It's our best sponge in terms of soaking up flood water and even sea level rise. I mean, it's the best friend we have if we want to continue to live in South Florida.
The public, maybe the reason that they're not as engaged is that these issues seem overwhelming. Well, what can I do to respond? There are responses, and government's working on a lot of them. The private sector is working on a lot of them.
The Everglades Restoration Project includes protecting water quality and water storage needs and restoring the natural flow of water from Lake Okeechobee to the Everglades. All across South Florida, from the wetlands of the Everglades to the East Coast beaches to the low-lying keys, most experts agree that the first step in facing sea level rise is communication and outreach.
The way you communicate with people is through their own experience and through their own connection to where they live. When you tie it to someone's experience or where they live, it's a lot more meaningful and powerful. Whereas what's happening now is we have all of these kind of cookie cutter phrases, everyone's being very technical, and all of this science is not, there's this gap between information and action. We have this knowledge and it's not being applied because it's not being translated to decision makers.
Thank you again.
In Miami-Dade County, the decision makers have gotten the message. On January 21st, 2015, after years of work by two different task forces chaired by Clerk of Courts Harvey Rubin, County Commissioner Rebecca Sosa handed the job of immediate action on sea level rise to County Mayor Carlos Jimenez.
I recognize leadership of Commissioner Sosa and Harvey Rubin on this task force.
The turning point was that for the first time, all the proposals were approved and the green light to go ahead and protect the county was given. That was the turning point.
The mayor's office says that their first step is to work with what they call the natural system, which begins with the beaches.
The more the beaches are extended, the farther out the water will be kept. The dunes are a very important part of that. The much more quiet part of that is our environmentally sensitive lands that we're purchasing on the southeastern part of the county. It's an area that will flood, and so the more we keep out of development, the more we keep in natural systems, the better we'll have a place where the water will go for a while. But simultaneous to everything else, we're doing a complete redo of our water and sewer system. Every major facility that we build is going to be deal with sea level rise as a part of its construction.
I think that this is not just a county issue, not just a water and sewer issue, but it's a county-wide issue, it's a regional-wide issue, because everybody's going to have to work together to come up with solutions on this, and to come up with the solutions that will make this area livable in a sustainable fashion for the next 100, 150, 200 years, whatever that time frame is.
Options to improve sustainability and resiliency are now on the table, but county officials say implementation must be supported by an engaged public.
When you're talking about something that maybe isn't quite so apparent now and is projected into the future, sometimes it's hard to say that that's a priority that we need to be spending money on. But quite frankly, this is the time to take advantage of the opportunities we have to plan and prepare, because if we don't take these opportunities now, then the social and economic impacts in the future are going to be significantly worse.
While citizens and political leaders plan for an uncertain future that is coming at an uncertain pace, leaders from coastal communities around the world are watching to see what we in South Florida are doing and how much we are spending to keep paradise alive and well for generations to come. For more on sea level rise in South Florida, visit eyesontherise.org.
Today is about experiencing the climate impacts up close and personal.
If sea level rises the way that we think that they're anticipated to rise, is there may be areas in South Florida that will be uninhabitable.
Whenever there's an event, an emergency, a disaster, a lot of times it's a wake-up call.
These extreme high tides that we're experiencing are kind of the ultimate experience of sea level rise in our residents' lives.
We're not asking enough questions. We're really not asking enough of realtors who buy and sell those properties with people. Do you know what's coming? Maybe they don't know.
If we don't take these opportunities now, then the social and economic impacts in the future are going to be significantly worse.
South Florida is one of the most vulnerable regions in the world to the impacts of rising seas. Climate change is causing the ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica to melt, and as temperatures rise, the oceans are warming and expanding. According to the 2014 National Climate Assessment, seas could rise 2 feet by 2060. In Florida, 2.4 million people live within 4 feet of the local high tide line. More than 13 million of Florida's 18 million residents live in coastal counties. Coastal developments were valued in 2010 at $2 trillion.
Maybe 100 years from now or 200 years from now, if sea level rises the way that we think that they're anticipated to rise, is there may be areas in South Florida that will be uninhabitable. We need to start looking at how do we move those people away from those areas in a logical and realistic fashion now.
As sea level rise occurs, it will affect both the coastal area and the western parts. We walk all around on what I call a big sponge, and that is the aquifer, the freshwater aquifer that we use for our drinking water.
The bedrock under Florida is not solid. It has holes in it. This is the sort of bedrock we have, which means that water travels into it easily and out of it easily.
Even on sunny days, became a major concern and finally a political issue during the 2013 mayoral election. The promise of its new mayor, Philip Levine, was to keep the streets dry.
The 4 lanes of Alton Road, originally scheduled to open at the end of next summer, will now open this December, 7 months ahead of schedule.
Even with Levine's accelerated schedule, the flooding and the construction made life difficult for business owners. Pippa Seacrest, co-founder of the Miami Ad School, relocated her business in 2014 to the Wynwood neighborhood, But before the move, she lived with the flooding on Alton Road.
We've been in this building for 20 years, and over time the water has gotten worse and worse and worse to the point where it rusts the undercarriage.
And when salt water is coming in from the ocean, it can push up and just travel upwards underground. It doesn't have to have, you know, storm sewer or anything to be able to get upwards.
And it also means that the low-lying interior, like the Everglades and stuff, are suddenly going to have pressure coming from underneath and pushing up. And so besides the salt water coming over the edge, we're going to get this sort of pushing up of fresh water in the center, and so there's going to be flooding everywhere.
Throughout South Florida, residents, non-governmental organizations, and government officials alike are trying to understand the potential impacts of sea level rise while using the newest technology available to deal with the rising waters. In Miami Beach, an area often referred to as ground zero of climate change, constant flooding during high tides and